So, gleich zu Anfang möchte ich noch was sagen, den Elefanten im Raum adressieren, selbstverständlich, weil Sie vielleicht auch die Berichterstattung von gestern und heute gelesen haben. Das Museum bekennt sich selbstverständlich zu den Washingtoner Prinzipien. Das haben wir den Nachfahren von Heinrich Stahl gegenüber immer deutlich gemacht, auch den Journalisten, die sich an uns gewandt haben. Und auf Grundlage der Recherchen gehen wir davon aus, dass es sich bei dem Brunnen um NS-Raubgut handelt. Wir haben allen beteiligten Parteien immer wieder betont, dass wir offen und bestrebt sind, gemeinsam mit den Nachfahren eine gerechte und faire Lösung zu finden. Bitte beachten Sie, die Nachfahren Heinrich Stahls und das Museum sind sich einig, dass heute nicht die juristischen Verhandlungen im Mittelpunkt stehen sollen, sondern die Geschichte des Brunnens. Und diese Geschichte ist untrennbar mit der Verfolgung von Heinrich, Jenny und Bruno Stahl und deren Erinnerung verbunden. Und in diesem Sinne beginnen wir nun. Dear Gunstream family, dear Stahl family, dear colleagues, I messed it up. Gunstream and Stahl, sorry. Dear Gunstream family, dear Stahl family, dear colleagues, dear audience. We have gathered here today because we want to tell the entangled histories of a fountain. We are looking at its object history, at its iconography, at the museum's grappling and unfinished process to come to terms with its multiple layers of history. But above all, we would like to share with you the history of its commissioners, Heinrich and Jenny Stahl. And I'm seizing this moment to especially welcome the descendants of the Stahl family who came here from the United States. So for us, this is a very special moment for which I would like to thank the families for their trust. The event is therefore in English, and we apologize if we might get lost in translation. I would also like to welcome my wonderful co-speakers, Elisa Tamaschke, Curator and Head of Collections and Research at the museum, as well as Lynn Rother, the Lichtenberg-Professor for Provenance Studies at the Leuphana Universität in Lüneburg. This event today is part of our reassessment and critical questioning of the Georg Kolbe Museum's institutional history of the past 75 years. This also reaches beyond its founding in 1950 and into the life and work of the sculptor Georg Kolbe. He was one of the most successful sculptors of the first part of the 20th century, working throughout 4 different political systems and building this place here as a studio home in 1928. With the multi-platform research project, The Fountain, we are attempting to forge new ways of looking at difficult histories of violence and dispossession, always being led by our institutional quest to ask what stories are being told and what stories remain untold. What is lying buried in the archive and what is missing? And what is missing is everything that has not been researched, that has not been said, that has not been addressed in its full complexity. Therefore, we need to produce knowledge, more knowledge, and share this knowledge to close the gaps. But what is also missing is a methodology for museum work, which has to be developed alongside those issues. A methodology that is also geared towards a more intersectional approach that lets us think different histories together and in relation to one another. We are searching for methods that are not about control, but about posing open questions and through them creating a critical presence that can lead to a shared future. We do this in an open process, therefore not holding back between closed doors, but involving different groups of people with very different approaches to an ever-evolving network of creation, exchange, and learning. We want to live up to the dream of an open museum, which is a point of gathering, of bringing together different opinions and histories and to look at them together in all their unresolvedness and especially in the urgent task they give us today. Museum work is intrinsically connected to memory work, and this, in reference to Maria Plaza-Lazo's take on art criticism, should no longer be the performance of a sovereign knowing better, but the careful practice of attending to what was, and more so, of what can come into being. And with this, I hand over to my colleague Elisa Tamaschke, who will share the story of the Dancers' Fountain and the lives of Heinrich and Jenny Stahl.
As Kathleen Reinhardt mentioned in her introduction, our research project, The Fountain, is multi-layered. And one of the leading questions regarding the fountain in our museum's garden was, is it appropriate? Is it just? Is it fair that it is here in this garden? Guided by this question, we began our research, visited various archives and consulted our own museum's archive. In doing so, we found ourselves engaging deeply with the institutional history of this very house, a focus that also underpins our current exhibition, Tea and Dry Biscuits. I will introduce you to the story of the fountain. In 1922, Heinrich Stahl commissioned Georg Kolbe to create a fountain for his property Im Dol in Berlin-Dahlem. Stahl was a Berliner. He was born in Berlin-Rudow in 1868, and he worked at the Victoria Insurance Company as a director. He was an important member of the Jewish community in Berlin. It is very likely that he saw the sculpture of a dancer by Kolbe in an exhibition and approached Kolbe with a request to create a fountain for his and his wife's Jenny's garden. Kolbe had created a number of fountain designs in the early 20th century. However, only a few of them were actually realized, which makes the Stahl fountain so very special. For this fountain, Kolbe combined elements from earlier designs and various sculptural concepts. He translated the mythological theme and the art historical classical motive of the dancing nymph, a female nature spirit, into a modern contemporary form. Since at least 1905, the dancer has been a central motive in Georg Kolbes' work. In 1911-12, the dancer acquired by the Berlin National Gallery, der Nationalgalerie, marked the sculptor's breakthrough into the world of collectors and art institutions, as well as into the world of exhibition audiences who henceforth admired him for the vitality of his figures. Modern expressive dance, which was a decisive and much-cited source of inspiration for Kolbe, transformed the perception and representation of body. It paved the way for a new attitude toward life. The depiction of black men to be found on the fountain's base appears in Kolbe's work for the first time around the same period as the creation of the dancer. In 1912, he produced a group of drawings and sculptures portraying a Somali man in crouching and standing poses. Comparable to similar motifs in Expressionism, Kolbe's work shows influences of exotism, and these influences extended over a longer period. Notably, he directly transferred the figure of the crouching man from 1912 into the supporting figures of the 1922 fountain. With the fountain for Stahl, Kolbe combined a motive that was already popular in his work, the dancer, with the equal popular motive of supposed exotism of the non-European. In doing so, he created an object whose two components, although seemingly unrelated in narrative terms, catered to the tastes of time. With our project, it is essential to us to honor Jenny and Heinrich Stahl. We still know relatively little about Jenny and more about Heinrich. We hope to change that in the future. Heinrich Stahl served as chairman of the Jewish community in Berlin between 1933 and 1940. In this role, he founded and supported orphanages, homes for the elderly and homeless, set up soup kitchens through the Jewish Winter Relief Organization, offered comfort, assisted with emigration paperwork, and helped establish contacts abroad to help before and after an emigration. Heinrich and Jenny Stahl were also significant art collectors and friends of artists. Their collection included works by Slevogt, Corinth, Delacroix, Courbet, and also Max Liebermann, with whom the couple shared a personal friendship. When Liebermann died in 1935, the Gestapo prohibited mourners from attending the funeral. Stahl, as a family friend and chairman of the Jewish community, and Georg Kolbe attended. For a long time, Stahl decided to remain in Germany in order to continue his work within the Jewish community. It was only in 1940 that Jenny and he decided to emigrate. Their son Bruno had already left the fascist country with his family. Heinrich and Jenny paid the Reichsfluchtsteuer, but the Gestapo prevented them from leaving nonetheless. In 1942, they were arrested and deported to Theresienstadt concentration camp. Heinrich Stahl survived only a few months there, murdered by the unimaginable, brutal, inhumane fascist system. The fate of Heinrich and Jenny Stahl had already been reported extensively in the New York Jewish newspaper Der Aufbau before their deportation to Theresienstadt. Der Aufbau was an important source of information and communication for émigrés and reported in detail on events in Germany. On the 4th of December 1942, a death notice appeared in the newspaper. My most beloved husband, father-in-law, our dearest grandfather, Heinrich Stahl, passed away peacefully on the 4th of November in Theresienstadt. Was the conventional phrasing "passed away peacefully" an attempt by the bereaved to momentarily conceal the degrading, inhumane suffering of the concentration camp? Jenny Stahl survived Theresienstadt. In 1950, Der Aufbau reported on her arrival in New York. I'm sorry, my marks left our presentation. This is where Jenny is mentioned. She was reunited with her son Bruno in New York, who had emigrated via Cuba. And the fountain? In 1941, Heinrich and Jenny Stahl were forced by Nazi law to sell their property, including the fountain, at a price far below its value. The buyer was the Bulgarian consul Theodor Dimanov, who had lived not far from the Stahls in Dahlem. How close they actually lived, I will show you. This is the street Im Dohl, where Heinrich Stahl and his wife lived. This is the Archivstraße, where Theodor Dimanov lived. Well, I'm sorry. So the first street I showed is the street where Heinrich Stahl lived and Jenny Stahl lived. The second one where Dimanov lived until he bought the villa of the Stahls. Dimanov later claimed to have been a friend and supporter of Stahl during the Nazi period. We suppose none of that is true. In fact, by profession and at the latest since Bulgaria joined the Axis powers on the 1st of March 1941. He was a political ally of the Nazis, as becomes clear, not least through a newspaper report about a dinner with Adolf Hitler, which he attended. So his name is mentioned in that article about the visit of the Prime Minister of Bulgaria in Berlin. Shortly after the end of World War II, Dimanov moved to Spain, fascist Franco-Spain, and took the bronze dancer from the fountain with him, leaving the fountain base behind. Knowledge of its whereabouts were soon lost. The base disappeared from the former Stahl property. In 1951, Jenny Stahl and her son Bruno filed a restitution claim against Dimanov for the property im Dol, including the fountain. After tough negotiations and numerous false statements by Dimanov, a settlement was reached in 1953. A payment of $2,000 to the Stahl family was agreed upon. The value of the fountain was included in that minimal sum. What had become of the fountain was unknown to the Stahl family and also to the Georg Kolbe Museum, which had opened its doors in 1950. In fact, during the negotiations, Dimanov had lied and claimed the fountain no longer existed. Fast forward 2 decades. In 1973, the Georg Kolbe Museum became aware through a newspaper article that the bronze sculpture was, in fact, still in the possession of the Dimanov family in Spain. In 1978, the sculpture was purchased from Dimanov's descendants for the museum with funds from the Lottery Foundation. This purchase was made by Maria von Thiesenhausen, who was the museum's director at the time and the granddaughter of Georg Kolbe. She left the position shortly after to move back permanently to Canada, where she had moved to in the 1950s. The subsequent director, Ursel Berger, a young art historian, then placed an ad in Berlin newspapers in search of the fountain base. It was eventually found in the garden of a retirement home in Berlin. In 1979, the base and the dancer were united, again with lottery funds, and installed in the garden of the Georg Kolbe Museum. The new director began researching the fate of Heinrich Stahl, the circumstances of the sale under duress, and the role of Theodor Dimanov. She requested from the previous director the correspondence with Dimanov from the time of the bronze's acquisition, but did not receive it. Still today, that marks a missing piece in our archive. Some of the information she was able to obtain was contradictory, but in 1987, after Werner Stahl, Heinrich and Jenny Stahl grandson, visited the museum and a connection was established, the museum was able to ask him questions via mail. However, archival records do not reveal how and if answers were communicated. In 2001, the legal representative of the Stahl's descendants approached the museum, stating rightly that the fountain was a forced sale under persecution and asking for a conversation about it. The family ultimately decided not to pursue restitution, but asked that a commemorative plaque honoring Heinrich Stahl be installed near the fountain. I will conclude for now and hand over to Kathleen Reinhardt, but not without noting that the fountain's post-war history still raises many unresolved questions we aim to pursue further. In our research process, we actively pursued contact with the descendants of Heinrich and Jenny, and Bruno Stahl and his children, and are now working together on a fair and just solution for the fountain.
So the last trace in our archive is this letter from 2001 by the lawyer von Trotz-Solz, declaring that the heirs of Heinrich Stahl waive any claims to the fountain, but would appreciate a memorial plaque in order to make visible this violent history of dispossession. I was startled to not find this plaque, so this was the starting point for this project. And this is also what brings us here today. Under the impression that all legal matters were resolved, we started to think about ways to remember, but also of ways to make present the entangled histories culminating in this hyper-object. Max Czolek, poet, publicist, and co-founder of the Coalition of Pluralistic Public Discourse and part of the publication The Fountain, writes, "Anyone who takes remembrance seriously must accept the fact that the past injustices cannot be made good by it, and that the wounds inflicted cannot be closed, and that remembering is linked to the task of naming and combating discriminatory structures in the present." We took up this task by initiating a number of projects I will elaborate on a bit later. One detail that spoke to me as a scholar of African American art when looking at the Dancer's Fountain were the three carrier figures that were forming the base. The recognition that these were figures with black features, evoking the art historical motif of black or enslaved carrier figures, made me ask, what kind of world does this artwork capture or propose? What was the meaning of it then, but especially, what is its meaning now, when our contemporary gaze meets these crouching black men? So to ask, what can this actually stand in a public museum garden in the 21st century in Berlin? One central socio-political challenge of our time lies in the critical examination of European colonial histories and current decolonial processes. Therefore, it is important to understand structures and systems of discrimination and racism precisely, so not to confuse being a racist with being socialized within racist structures, for example. Germany's memory culture is facing a reckoning today, as the country grows more diverse and memory and stories of remembering become more diverse as a result. What is necessary is to acknowledge that these histories, in their particularity, but also through the lines of connection that bind them together. It was only at the very end of compiling the text for the publication, The Fountain, that we came across the complex biography of Mohamed Noor, who may have been the model for the fountain's supporting figures. The cultural scientist, Africanist, and curator Annette Hoffmann traced his story in the course of her work with the sound archives of the colonial era. We already knew that it was a Somali model, possibly with the name of Hassano, with whom the painter Max Slevogt also worked. Now we have a more complete, indeed moving biography. It finally gives a name, more than 100 years later, to a person who repeatedly modeled for artists of the time and who has been reduced to a purely aesthetic cipher in Western art history. Mohamed Noor came to Germany as an intellectual from Somalia with an ethnological ensemble. He was a civilian prisoner of war in World War I, where his voice was recorded. He posed as a model and worked as a language assistant at the Hamburg Institute for Colonial Languages, laying the base for Somali grammar. The scholar Sadija Hartmann has written on critical fabulation as a way not to lament what isn't in the archives, but to use these voids to fill them with radical and urgent subject matter, to ask how do we use these archival materials, where the subaltern, the other, appears, largely through the violence done to them, to try to make other kinds of stories. So not reconstructing these totalizing histories, but to work to rearrange these materials so that they might yield another kind of rendering of these lives lived. I invited the Afro-Jewish artist David Hart to create a new artwork for our museum garden. And it's there. You see a large screen that is embedded in the garden's flora and is surrounded by a bed of fireweed and small balsam, plants thriving also in very inhospitable environments. The small balsam found its way into botanical theories, which were reformulated into race theories at the beginning of the last century, that were then taken up by the National Socialists to establish their own race theories. The fireweed is known for its highly resistant spread and also grows in damaged or contaminated soil after wars or environmental disasters. Based on the poses of the fountain's black figures, on Kolbe's drawings and the photographs of his work, Hart lets a contemporary dancer practice a concentrated choreography. This contemporary artistic contemplation poses questions about interconnected relations between culture and environment, periphery and center, Heimat and estrangement, and asks what it means to be alienated from one's own body in a foreign landscape. How to contaminate and thus enrich the grounds as you pollinate it with the poetic otherness. This was just one project in a multitude of projects we initiated in order to work through the different aspects that need to be addressed. In parallel to seeking direct contact to the descendants of Heinrich and Jenny Stahl, we conceptualized projects of remembrance, but also of political education. And I'm quickly walking you through these projects, which help us imagine new practices that could guide the museum also in the years to come. We invited the Critical Friends to contribute to a publication, which in detail portrays the story of the fountain as an unlawfully appropriated object during the Nazi era and the fate of its commissioners. It assembles contributions by a new generation of authors and artists, centering on working through different paths and difficult paths via artistic means. The high school students of the Thomas Mann Gymnasium worked on a large textile piece together and wrote texts while exploring the intersecting histories of National Socialism and colonialism. This project was supported by the Federal Agency for Civic Education. The University of Arts MA program, Art in Context, was working with our museum around the Dancers Fountain, around the Citadel Spandau's depot of unwanted public art, as well as the Leni Riefenstahl estate of the Nuba photographs held by the state collections here in Berlin. They then developed a new educational art project and presented those art projects last Sunday, an event from which you can still see traces in our sculpture courtyard, follow the poetic signs close to the garden sculptures, and hear a moving sound walk in our audio guide. The research exhibition in the museum's lower level gives insights into archival materials around the fountain, which while reconstructing its history and that of its commissioners. It is using the exhibition format as a mode of expanding thinking, and I encourage you to have a look at it after the event. So all of these projects testify also to my understanding of the museum not as a static institution, but as Clementine de Lis proposes, a metabolic space of transformation, of experimentation, and of learning. This proposes a radical open model in which collections are not fixed heritage, but living matter, which are ready to be constantly reinterpreted anew and shared widely. In closing, and before introducing Lynn Rother, I would like, however, to come back to the beginning to where this all started and to the people without whom we would not be gathered here today, Heinrich and Jenny Stahl, who had the inspiration to commission this fascinating object. And thus, again, I want to reiterate my gratitude to the descendants to be here today. Thank you. Thank you. So now I'm introducing Lynn Rother. Lynn Rother is the Lichtenberg Professor for Provenance Studies and the director of the Provenance Lab at Leuphana University. She also serves as the inaugural curator for provenance at the Museum of Modern Art in New York in an adjunct role. Prior to these appointments, she had held positions at the MoMA and the Berlin State Museums, where she worked on 20th century provenance and digital initiatives. A former fellow of the Getty Research Institute in Los Angeles and the German Historical Institute in Moscow, she has a master's degree in art history, economics, and law from the University of Leipzig and a PhD in art history from the Technical University of Berlin, advised by Benedict Savoy. Her award-winning book from 2017, Kunst durch Kredit, explored how art was used as a financial collateral during the Weimar era and the Nazi regime. Rother's recent scholarship focuses primarily on the future of provenance, informing international museum practices and cultural policy decisions. Welcome, Lynn.
Thank you for the kind introduction. I was invited to this panel to reflect on the general state of provenance from the perspective of a former provenance researcher, now a professor of provenance studies. After my short input, I will ask a few questions and start a discussion. Does the microphone work? I'm too far away? Yeah. Okay, sorry. We are here today, and you can hear me, because 2 years ago, Kathleen Reinhardt and Elisa Tamaschke began questioning the history of the fountain not long after Kathleen began her tenure as director of the Georg Kolbe Museum. As we've learned, the fountain was not intended for the garden where we are here today, but for the garden of Heinrich and Jenny Stahl, persecuted as Jews. They were forced to sell their Dahlem house along with the fountain under duress in Nazi Germany, a case of Nazi-looted art, as Kathleen and Lisa have made clear. Objects do usually not carry their history on their sleeve. For it to be known, it requires someone who is interested in it, searches for it, and eventually brings it to light. This involves work, more often than not a great deal of work that has been, in many cases, neglected for far too long. It is often claimed that provenance research has always been part of art historical methods. However, this is not exactly true. Provenance research as a scientific method of investigation only emerged in the aftermath of the 1998 Washington Principles on Nazi-confiscated art, owing in part to the financial and political support that was committed for sustained provenance research initiatives. In Germany alone, these are the updated statistics, 468 Nazi-era provenance research projects have been supported by the government between 2008 and December 2024 with funding of approximately 55 million euros. This has led to the restitution of over 32,500 objects since 1998. Of these, 7,500 objects were restituted by museums, often amicably and following proactive research by the institutions. Before this massive growth of provenance and restitution research, art history, whether practiced in museums, universities, or the media, had only what I would call a piecemeal relationship with provenance. I would like to expand on this hypothesis by briefly sharing a historical case study with you today. As is often the case with prominent artists, the current whereabouts and previous owners of their work can be found in specialized art historical literature, particularly in the catalogue Raisonné. The work that I would like to focus on for a moment is Eduard Manet's Aspergesbandel from 1880. The still life was acquired for the Wallraf-Richartz Museum in Cologne in 1968, where it remains to this day. Here is the provenance of this very still life published in this art historical specialized catalogue Raisonné of 1975. What I want to emphasize, without you being scared of the details, it is the space dedicated to provenance, or rather the lack thereof. The much longer paragraphs above detail the exhibitions where the work has been shown and the publications in which the painting has been referenced. Provenance comes last, here now enlarged. In that very short final section dedicated to provenance, we find in French that a Frussi bought it from the artist studio in 1880. It then changed hands from Cassirer to Bernstein, then to Max Liebermann, who we heard, and then to his heirs before ultimately arriving at the Wallraf-Richartz Museum. Setting the current owner prominently apart from the rest of the names was one of the stylistic decisions of this catalogue. Another decision was to use italics to indicate the ambivalent role of the art dealer as an owner or a custodian. This is used here for Cassirer, the prominent Berlin promoter of Impressionism. Indeed, syntax and punctuation confer meaning. Where the order of the provenance pertains to the chronological succession of owners, a semicolon stands for a direct transfer of ownership. In this way, provenance writing becomes a kind of shorthand, or in German, Stenografie. This list-like style of provenance was established in the Parisian art market during a significant 18th century expansion and remains the most common form of recording provenance information to this day. For our still life, the pre-museum provenance is presented as an uninterrupted history spanning art collectors and promoters, first in the US, first in Europe, and then in the US. Yet in fact, these names stand for belonging and betrayal of European Jewry, to borrow the title of Charles Delheim's book, which traced how Jews helped make the art world modern and how their lives and careers were systematically disrupted and cut short by the Nazi persecution, forced migration, and murder. But the provenance record does not reflect any of these tragedies or turmoils, nor does it hint to forced migration or the Holocaust. Confining provenance to such lists in their sparest form on museum labels and in exhibition catalogue entries is, according to Anne Higonnet, a sign that art history has not been ready to confront the challenging ways in which the meaning of objects is transformed over time. Moreover, in this list-like style, these 20th century catalogue Raisonné provenances might appear scientifically rigorous. This impression is heightened by the fact that they often appear alongside lists of exhibitions and published references, sections that are intended to be as complete as possible. Yet art history has a more complicated and, as I said, piecemeal relationship with provenance. I want to demonstrate this by showing provenance information that was exhibited the year before the catalogue Raisonné was published, but this time compiled not by art historians or art dealers, but by a conceptual artist, which I think can help us to see a bit more clearly what is at stake for public memory and justice in these lists. Hans Haake, the artist who is today acknowledged as a leading figure of institutional critique, a movement that critically examined bureaucratic power in the art world and in society at large, used Manet's Asperges bundle for a work titled Manet Project 74, which he exhibited in a solo show at the Commercial Gallery of Paul Menz in Cologne in 1974. Is a historic photo. On the left wall of Harke's artwork, we see 5 text panels. There were 10 in total. On the right wall was a color reproduction of Manet's Asperges bundle from 1880. Originally, Harke had envisioned realizing his work with the original oil painting for a contemporary art exhibition at the Wallraf-Richartz-Museum. Among other select artists, he was invited by the museum to propose an artwork for the museum's 150th anniversary. According to Harke, the curator in charge, Evelyn Weiss, was enthusiastic about his proposal. The project was, however, rejected for the museum's anniversary exhibition, which had tellingly adopted the slogan "Kunst bleibt Kunst, art remains art." Harke still realized his exhibition at the nearby Commercial Gallery of Paul Menz. He called the museum's decision censorship and published his entire lengthy correspondence on the exhibition poster of his very gallery exhibition. So why did Horst Keller, the then museum director, prevent the original version of Manet's still life from being shown along with Harke's provenance documentation? Let's look at the panels more closely. Here we see a panel dedicated to Max Liebermann, the German Jewish artist, friend of Heinrich Stahl, who bought the painting for 24,300 Reichsmark in 1907, according to the 2 lines at the top. In documentary-like sobriety, the texts present his family background, achievements, and recognition as a painter, but also his and his wife's persecution during the Nazi regime. While he died in 1935 of natural causes, Martha committed suicide in 1943 to escape persecution, as noted in the last lines. Another of Harke's panels was dedicated to Hermann Josef Abs, a banker and the then president of the Kuratorium of the Wallraf-Richartz Museum, a kind of museum acquisition committee composed of donors. The catalogue raisonné, however, did not mention him at all. Harke decided to dedicate a panel to him because multiple museum publications had emphasized his essential role in the acquisition of Manet's still life in 1968. Similarly to the other panels, his achievements are described in a documentary style, listing only his many board mandates during the Nazi regime and in post-war Germany, but also his categorization as a person exonerated and Lasteter from the Allies' denazification campaign, as well as his post-war honorary awards from states and universities. As we know from the published correspondence between the artist and the museum director, the latter was particularly opposed to the inclusion of the panels on Abs. He claimed that it would be wrong to judge a man's spiritual commitment by the many offices he had held throughout his life. I would not be surprised if other aspects of the provenance did not appeal to the museum director either. The stark contrast between the history of the Liebermann family, whose lives were characterized by disruption, suicide, and migration, and the continuous career of Abs in Germany, West Germany, may have been another reason why the museum director did not want to see Harke's work realized in the proposed form. Moreover, museums do not usually display their acquisition prizes in exhibitions, if they disclose them at all. In Harke's work, they feature prominently in the very first line of each panel. In fact, Keller, the museum director, went so far as to explain that the museum knows nothing of economic power, only of spiritual power, and this geistige Macht must be preserved by protecting the acquisition history of each individual painting or work from one-sided interpretations. I'm using this case because it was not merely a single museum director at a specific historical moment repressing parts of an object's provenance. Art history has, for the longest time, had a complicated relationship with the violent and contradictory pasts of its objects. But I want to make two more comments on the art historical versus the artistic provenance records from the 1970s. While the catalogue raisonné included only male dealers, Harke acknowledged all agents, including Marianne Falchenfeld, former Breslauer, the pioneering photographer of the Weimar era, who married into the art dealer firm Falchenfeld. Harke also consistently differentiated between ownership and custody. The lack of scientific rigor in the art historical catalogue not only manifests in who is included and who is omitted, and what role they played in the object's life, it also becomes apparent in discriminatory naming conventions. Two of Harke's provenance boards, for example, were explicitly dedicated to Max and Martha Liebermann's heirs. The first, their daughter Käthe Rietzler, who had fled Nazi Germany with her husband Kurt, and then their daughter Maria White. In the catalogue raisonné, these two female owners were instead listed together with the men they happened to marry as Mrs. Kurt Rietzler and Mrs. Howard B. White, respectively. The short takeaway is that Harke's information is more scientific in almost every respect than the scholarly provenance, or so-called scholarly provenance, although the artist's research was published a year earlier. Before I share my second takeaway, I would like to explain briefly why art history produced provenance records that did not meet scientific standards. The answer lies in the provenance of provenance itself. Such lists, as we have seen earlier, have their origins in the 18th century, Parisian art market, and were shaped by commercial interests, focused on proving authenticity and resolving attribution questions. We can examine numerous examples that demonstrate how our history's practice of provenance was reduced to a simplified cataloging task, a practice uncritically adopted from the art market. A genuinely scientific and methodologically sound provenance research practice only emerged after 1998, following the Washington Principles Agreement, when material commitments to sustained provenance research were made. My second takeaway from our provenance comparison is that upon re-examining Harke's work, we can see clearly that the least space on each board is dedicated to the object itself. He did not include the numerous exhibitions in which this work was shown, although the context and setting in which a work is displayed certainly impact its meaning and value. Instead, he prioritized the people who have been part of this painting's life. It is not for me to decide whether he captured their lives and traumas adequately, or to judge if this is an appropriate way of commemorating the Holocaust while also remembering the achievements and fates of the protagonists. Descendants, families, legal successors, or other representatives of Holocaust victims often have very different wishes. But Harke had, in fact, compiled the information not only through archival documentation, but also through conversations with Maria White, the granddaughter of Max and Martha Liebermann. I would argue that he pioneered what I would call a human-centered approach to provenance. Indeed, as artists like Harke have demonstrated, provenance research is not merely a matter of tracing objects. It is about tracing people, their lives, and the truths they leave behind. It is about listening to voices that history has tried to silence and finding the courage to speak for those who can no longer speak for themselves. As scholars, museum professionals, and citizens, we carry the responsibility not only to record facts, but to acknowledge suffering, resilience, and humanity. My hope is that we continue to look not merely at objects, but through them, so that each piece of art can become a bridge connecting the realities of the past to the understanding of the present, a bridge that rests ultimately on the humans, their worlds, and their lives that they were a part of. Thank you. We still hope to have a bit of your attention. We're thinking to raise some of the questions, and also what I have just sort of elaborated on a human-centered approach to provenance. Kathleen and Elisa, the way, and I think it has been mentioned that you had reached out basically, I mean, you found the files, you found this unresolved provenance, then you had reached out to, yes, you are in conversation now. And you have not, no one has ever fully researched provenance. As provenance researchers know, this can take decades. No one has interest to research it for the next decades, but to accept for education. But by looking through these files, what I would like to ask first is, from this human-centered perspective to provenance research, what were, would you say, the moments of injustice in this fountain's history, and also in sort of your understanding how the museum sort of handled it and society has handled it? Where would you, could you elaborate on these moments and stories?
Thank you, Lynn. I think there were several moments of injustice in that story around the fountain of Heinrich and Jenny Stahl, and the first one is, of course, 1942 and the cell under duress of the fountain to Theodor Dimanov. And the second moment, which is again devastating, is the moment in the 50s, the early 50s, 1951 till 1953, when the Stahls try to, the descendants of Heinrich Stahl, his widow Jenny, try to regain some of this which once belonged to them. And there was, as I mentioned, that conversation between this legal conversation between the descendants of Stahl and of Theodor Dimanov ended in a settlement, which meant that the family received $2,000, which is unbelievable for us. This kind of sum for a large property in Berlin with all these assets, one of them being the fountain. And I think this is not the last moment of injustice in that long story. Kathleen, would you like to go?
Yeah, I think this is wonderful, actually, that you bring this up, Lynn, and actually a perfect access from what you just tried to also explain, that that we have those different historical moments that we have to always see in their respective time and in their respective context, and it doesn't stop in the 50s. It is, I think, for me. So from what I somehow took also from the files that we have in the archive is that also in the early 70s, when then Maria von Tiesenhausen was addressing the Dimanovs and Theodor Dimanov, how does she know that this fountain dancer arrives there? She knows it because someone told the museum that it is there, but then she proactively goes to address him and wants to buy it, basically. And for her, it must have been clear from where he got it. We don't know this because in our files we only have then the letters, the many letters also of the director that came after her, Berger, who tried in so many occasions and over a long period of time to get information from her and to find out what happened. She asked her to give her the letters that were exchanged in this moment, and doesn't receive an answer. So the granddaughter of Kolbe, Maria von Tiesenhausen, blocks it and says this is private conversations and this is private letters. So I think in this moment also there is definitely something wrong, and there was done something wrong, and I mean it continues also then obviously because then Berger doesn't want to hold back with this. She contacts Werner Stahl directly in 87, 88. But here we have her letter telling him what she found, what she puzzled together. And then we have some notes from her that there was a phone call. Maybe he shared some more. There was just a brief note that he forwards this letter to his mother. And there, again, it stops. We don't know what happened. So I think those multiple points of entry are very important to always think with the fountain. Yeah.
And then also that in 2001, the commemoration plaque was actually not installed, although it was agreed on. Mm-hmm. That was. Mm-hmm. Would you call that a moment of injustice?
It depends. Of course, it's a moment of injustice. If something that is officially requested in this letter is not then fulfilled, and for us, I mean, this is the whole reason also why we're here, because we found this final letter to say we wish for a memory, and so we basically did everything to make this memory also alive, to bring this memory alive, and so. I think this is also something I wouldn't not definitely call an injustice in 2001 and until today, but it's it is definitely something that was missed and that we also miss at close to the fountain. And I think also the projects with the students in particular, they pointed this out and they were like, there are gaps, something is missing. We want to contribute something. We want to fill this missing spot.
But it's also, I think it's a delay or a negligence in a. I think that is what, and whether we need to give it a term or not. But I think it also, and this is what I tried to explain with sort of my input, which was also a revelation for me. I studied at 5 universities in Germany, art history, economics, and law, starting in the early 2000s, and I have never had come across of the topic of looted art or provenance. It was just absent. Also in the early 2000s, it was sort of like, okay, this problem has been now put upon us for some museums. They tried to solve it, thought they could solve it, thought they'd do a project, and then information is there, restitution claims have been made and solved, and then it's done. And I think now, 25 years later again, there is a very different awareness. I mean, there are some assistant professorships. I'm technically the only full tenured professorship for provenance studies in the world, thanks to an extremely progressive university president in Lüneburg who has a family history. He wanted a professorship for provenance studies. And this is what then also means talking, I mean, for my students, it's very normal. They are 18, they learn in their first semesters Introduction to Art History as Cultural Studies. One of the lecture is about the instrumentalization of and how art is engaged with provenance. The other lecture is only on looting and restitution. So they take it as a, but if we don't, if not museums and educators and universities sort of keep this work alive, with or without objects. I sometimes say, we can work with an empty frame. We can also, if this is where this upon agreed on, work with a ruin or with an empty space. Empty spaces can be filled with other artistic projects. So I think removing it from the legal, yes or no, but like actually as working through these topics is something I relate very much to as a professor, and also with the students who increasingly, in Lüneburg especially, have not necessarily gone to German schools and have had 2 years of Nazi history, which is still very present in most German schools, and then still they have never heard of looted art. They have never heard of individual. It is an abstract history that is told in numbers. What these objects do, they bring it to life, and they also allow to have this historic conversation in the presence through the means of these objects. And I think this is what I tried to explain with using or looking through these objects. And I think this is also, without putting these words in your mouth, what I see from the work that you have done through this publication, and sort of what are all the questions that like even can be posed, even if they cannot be answered in a straightforward, needed way. I wonder how the attention level and the need for coffee is, or if I otherwise should just address the last question, also what you have called the elephant in the room. I mean, to maybe just to recap also your proactive reaching out, your proactive way of talking about the unsolved problems, provenance, publishing it. But maybe this is because it is so, it has become maybe such a heated up discussion. Have you at any point ruled out restitution or addressing the legal terms of this provenance? I think this is a question to you as the director of the museum.
No, at no point have we ruled this out, obviously. And I think also what you bring up is this process is also something that was very quick in terms of, because you just addressed that sometimes provenance research takes decades also to execute and do this. And for me, it was very important to also do this in parallel to the projects that I addressed with the educational projects and with the collaborations with the publication also. Because this is something that usually in museums is negotiated behind closed doors, then maybe a public statement is released after a few years, and that was it. And for us, and for me personally, it's very important to make this into something that is alive and that has many different actors in it, and that can contribute, that can also show us the way, that can also lead us into new directions. So this whole story of Mohamed Noor is something that just came up, that sprung up during the research, for example, which of course makes us see the object in very different ways. But also the students' input was highly valuable in this way, because I think we are a generation still somehow sandwiched in between different generations and looking at this. When we were working with the students, when we were working also with the high school students, they have a very different opinion of how to handle those things and what is acceptable for them and what is not acceptable for them anymore. And I think this is, for me, very important to reflect, because this institution is a place where generations meet and where maybe different quests also towards a museum, towards an art institution meet. And to have those conversations is highly important, and to look at the audience of tomorrow, which is in their moral and ethic claims, like on a very different and very radical level, and rightly so. And so that's what we also take from there.
And I think also this maybe as the last comment, as like also because we said in this generation in between, but it's also when I was at school, and this is, I mean, I can speak for all of German pupils in our classes, we went to either a concentration or determination camp almost in a way wherever your school is closest. And in our case, so we had as German students, we talked to survivors, in that case of Theresienstadt. And for a 15-year-old growing up, this is however teenage or silly you are, and however cruel or ignorant you are to the politics going on. If you are visiting a termination or a concentration camp and you're speaking to a survivor who is willing and has the generosity, the dignity to talk to 15-year-olds, then this is extremely, I mean, it stays. I think it stayed for every German student. And we are, of course, coming to a point where we are not having the opportunity anymore to talk to survivors. So this direct history that can be told cannot be told. So we need to find means, we need to find tools, we need to try and see how without I think the naive thought of Wiedergutmachung, what it was called in West Germany, but with like working through it, addressing it and taking it as a process and as a conversation. And I think this is what was the idea behind this this public conversation. And I would like to thank Kathleen Reinhardt as a director. I would like to thank Elisa Tamaschke and thank the audience for the attention, and most importantly to the descendants that they came here to Berlin. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.